This talk that I'm going to give is on the myths of market failure. And to give you a little perspective, in the course of my career, I used to publish quite a bit in the area of antitrust and industrial organization. And one of the things I published in an article a long time ago in a journal called Economic Inquiry was about the origins of antitrust and what economists were thinking about antitrust regulation at the time the first antitrust law was passed, the Sherman antitrust law in the United States in 1890, the year 1890. And one of the things I found was that the American economics profession was almost unanimously opposed in principle to the whole idea of antitrust regulation. They thought it was inherently incompatible with the whole idea of competition. And the reason was they thought of competition, like the Austrians do, as a dynamic, rivalrous discovery process that involves entrepreneurship. It's ongoing, never ending. And they saw what was happening in their economic world at the time. There was a merger wave in the late 1880s in the United States, but they saw prices falling, output expanding. They saw new products, hundreds of new products being created. There was deflation for 35 years after the American Civil War, and they thought it was all good. It was all this competition, so they didn't see the merger wave of the time as a bad thing. That pretty much was the thinking until you get to around the 1920s and 30s, and the theory of competition changed. And the theory of competition that was held by those who called themselves professional economists became the theory of perfect competition. I don't know, maybe Peter Klein covered some of this in the last lecture, in the last class, but all of a sudden the thinking of competition went from dynamic, rivalrous entrepreneurship, the way Adam Smith saw it, the way the Austrians have always seen it, to this weird theory that says competition means many firms producing homogeneous products, homogeneous prices, costless entry and exit, and perfect information. And as Friedrich Hayek wrote in a famous article of his called The Meaning of Competition, in perfect competition, there is no competition. It's all assumed away. And so if you define competition in that way, that led to a huge industry in the economics profession of market failure theory. And the 1950s was probably the high point of the market failure theorizing, where there was market failure everywhere, because after all, nothing on earth is perfect. And so if you posit that this is what perfection is, and then you compare the real world to that, I sometimes call it this. You compare the real world to this bizarre model of utopia, and you say, aha, the market has failed. And so there were hundreds, probably thousands of articles written by economists, labeling anything that happened in the market as a failure because it failed to reach this. And it got to the point of absurdity. Even by the 1970s, the late Robert Bork, who taught antitrust law at Yale for, I think, 17 years or something like that, he wrote a book called The Antitrust Paradox. And there's a funny line in there. My favorite line in the whole book is that he said if the government actually tried to enforce perfect competition on the U.S. economy, it would have the same effect on wealth as several strategically placed nuclear explosions. And he wasn't an Austrian. I never thought of him as an Austrian economist, but he was a Chicago school law and economics guy. So he knew a bit about economics, and he wrote some pretty good things about that subject. And so you had this whole list of market failures based on basically what the economist Harold Demsetz called the nirvana fallacy. And this was in an article that Harold Demsetz, I'll write his name down here, for those of you who have never heard of Demsetz. He was a UCLA professor. Which I always thought he was very close to being an Austrian, although he never called himself an Austrian. But the way he wrote about markets was very consistent with with things that you'd expect to see from Peter Klein, for example, with the emphasis on entrepreneurship and a dynamic market. And so I always thought of him as a fellow traveler of the Austrians. But he coined this phrase in an article in the Journal of Law and Economics. I think it was 1969, 1970. It was called Information and Efficiency. I think it was called Two Viewpoints. And so that's the nirvana fallacy. And so what I have here in this list is 4 reasons why I think there are a lot of myths about market failure. And then I'm going to talk about some specific myths that I think have been debunked either by me or others. And the first one is the nirvana fallacy. Comparing the real world to utopia, the real world always falls short. The second is the ignoring of entrepreneurship. A lot of the market failure stories are externality stories, for example, and they just condemn the market for not being perfect in some way because they're the presence of externality problems. But human beings are problem solvers, at least some of us are, and especially when there's money involved. If there's money to be made, someone is going to figure out how to make that money. And a lot of times, the so-called externality problems are just that. They are solved by just that means. There's a way of making money in it, and somebody does and solves the problem in doing it. Some of our friends in Montana that run the Political Economy Research Center study what they call enviropreneurship, for example. And I just sent them an article from my local paper. I live in South Florida, and there's a brewery near my house, Saltwater Brewery. I noticed they sell the beer next door, Saltwater Brewery beer right next door. But these guys, I think they're going to make a lot more money by solving an environmental problem than they are selling beer. They're successful selling beer because they just rented out a barn in Delray Beach, Florida, and now I see their beer on tap at Mama Goldberg's. So they're going national and international, but they're environmentalists, and they figured out there's a problem if you live on the coast. You see these stories of fish choking to death on six-pack rings, plastic six-pack rings. They got the residue from brewing the beer, and they hired a chemist, and they figured out how to make six-pack rings that are degradable, so that they're good enough to hold 6 packs of beer or Pepsi or whatever. But they throw them into a fish tank, and the fish eat them. They eat these six-pack rings. And the local paper said they just had an order from like Anheuser-Busch for 50,000 of these things. And so that's the first order. So I don't know how much money they're going to make, but if you sell 50,000 of anything, that's a good piece of change. And they didn't. There's money in it. They didn't do it necessarily solely because they love fish or they felt sorry for fish choking to death. They're becoming very rich doing that. So that's the second reason. Third reason is lazy economists who spend their time never getting up out of their swivel chair in their faculty office and theorizing all day long without ever looking out the window to see if the world matches their theories. And then the fourth reason for this that I would give is it diverts attention to problems that are actually caused by government. A lot of problems, monopoly and so forth, that are historically been caused by government, all of a sudden they divert attention to say, no, it's the market that causes all these problems. So those are 4 reasons. So what are some examples that I want to talk about? The first one is antitrust, which I mentioned briefly earlier. And I once did a survey of all the when I was at George Mason University 100 years ago. I got all the books from the library. I had a research assistant that about antitrust law or antitrust economics. And I want to know, well, what are they saying about the origin of antitrust? Because by that time, the Chicago school mostly, and some of the Austrians, had decades of criticism of antitrust in practice. But all the books seem to say, but there was a golden age in the 1880s where antitrust was needed. We may have had 100 years of counterproductive policy that actually makes markets less competitive, but it was good at the beginning. And I wasn't really buying that story. And sure enough, all the books said, yeah, there was a golden age. There was rampant cartelization, rampant monopolization, and government came to the rescue and established the Sherman antitrust law. Okay, and that's the standard story that's still in a lot of the books. And so what I did was I tried to look for the data that would back this up, and found there was none. None of the books had any, not one statistic about any of it. So my research assistant and I dug it up. Went to the Library of Congress. We got all what data, the statistics of the United States from the Census Bureau. And one of the things we found, I'll give you just very briefly what I found. I published this article in the International Review of Law and Economics way back, I think 1984, I think is when it was. But 10 years prior to the Sherman Act being passed in 1890, GDP was growing at 24%. For that 10-year period, GDP, according to the government's own statistics, 24%. The average growth rate of industries that were accused of being monopolies by the U.S. Congress during that time grew at 175% on average. What is that? 7 times faster. So the industries that were accused of monopolizing industry were growing 7 times faster than the economy as a whole, and the economy as a whole was doing well. It's a period of deflation. The government's CPI fell by 7% during that decade, but these industries that were expanding their production 7 times faster than GDP were cutting prices even further. The steel rails, for example, fell by 53%. That was kind of pretty common during that time. And so what I found was that these industries that were targeted as monopolies, and even involved matches and castor oil that they were complaining about, were the fastest growing, fiercest price cutting, most innovating industries of all. So there was no monopoly. There was no monopoly.